Hi again then guys, and welcome to episode 8 of Pumpin Iron, the review series for the classic muscle cars of GT6. And in this episode we're featuring one of my personal favourite muscle cars on Gran Turismo 6, but a car which hasn't necessarily been one of my favourites for very long. And it is the 1970 Chevy Chevelle SS 454. Now this is a 70 grand car, which in muscle car terms is moderately expensive. It's one of the more expensive mainstream factory models. And it's also got one of the largest engines. It's a 454, as the name suggests, which equates to a 7.4 litre V8. It's supercharged when fully tuned and puts out 877 horsepower and 885 pound-feet of torque. So there's more than enough power and torque to get the job done both in a straight line and around the track. Surprisingly though, for a vehicle of its size and bulky looks, because it does look like a pretty heavy car, it's actually not. It only weighs 1,306 kilos with the full weight loss package, which is very impressive for a car of its size. And thanks to that very modest weight combined with its huge power, it has a very respectable power to weight ratio of 672 horsepower per tonne, which is pretty much supercar territory. What about in terms of performance though? How competitive is it in the muscle car class and also potentially beyond that? Well, I would say it's actually one of the best muscle cars in the game, and it's also one of the most underappreciated. You don't see very many people driving the Chevelle in comparison to, say, the Dodge Charger or the Chevy Camaro, for instance. Those models are more popular. However, it's a brilliant car, especially for a muscle car of its size. Generally, the larger muscle cars can be a bit cumbersome around corners, and although they're quick in a straight line, they tend to lose to the more compact muscle cars like the Camaro and the Cuda around corners. This muscle car, though, punches well above its weight and well below its size, because it's actually far more nimble and has much more track potential than you'd ever think it does. Now, its performance isn't among the very quickest of muscle cars in terms of top speed. The acceleration, though, is very strong, especially mid-range. There's a surprisingly minimal amount of wheel spin. Obviously with racing tyres, with sports or road tyres it would be different, but compared to other muscle cars, even with racing tyres, it wheel spins a lot less than most of them. Now the PP, when fully tuned, is perhaps a surprisingly low 583, which is significantly lower, for instance, than the Plymouth 440 Cuda, which is just under 600 PP. And for its PP, this car is very competitive. Now, I would suggest if you're going to use this car in racing, I would recommend having it at maybe the 525 to 575 PP level. Somewhere between those two is where it's at its best, and where you can really use the good points of this car to your best advantage. Now, the handling on this car, as I said, is surprisingly good, and one of the reasons for that is because of the weight distribution and the way it feels in the car. Many muscle cars feel like they're a bit too light over the rear end, and consequently they tend to slide constantly. And whereas with this car, of course, you can get the tail out, it's much better balanced in terms of its handling and drivability than many of the other muscle cars. And that's without any ballast. It's just naturally good like that. It's also relatively even in its dimensions. Most muscle cars tend to be either particularly wide or particularly long. Not many of them tend to be both. This car is more of a square in nature. Now obviously it's not square, but it's relatively wide and not overly long, but long enough to classify as a large muscle car. And the proportions are big enough for it to be a large muscle car, but not so big that it's cumbersome around tight tracks. The handling overall is surprisingly good and will give a lot of opponents a real shock around many tracks, even tracks where muscle cars usually wouldn't stand a chance. Now, as I said, for top-end performance it does fall behind some of the other muscle cars, but it's still a very strong performer. The top speed, even without NOS or draft, is over 230 miles per hour, and that's at the 583 pp level, so for its pp it is very quick. And let's face it, although muscle cars are cool to be able to say that you've got this or that top speed, there are very, very few tracks where you actually use that top speed. It's mostly about mid-range acceleration and handling. Those are the two most important attributes for most muscle cars. And this car's very good at both of those things. And with the top speed of around 230, it means you've got enough top speed for the vast majority of tracks. The only track that it really would fall behind its rivals on would of course be Special Stage Route X. On any other track, it's more than fast enough to keep up with, if not beat, its rivals. So if you haven't tried this car out before, and I get the feeling that quite a few people haven't for whatever reason, I would strongly recommend that you do so because it's a genuinely good all-round muscle car. Now, due to the massive torque, it does have a tendency to like to spin up its rear wheels. But even so, it's nowhere near as much as some of its rivals do, due to, as I mentioned earlier, the very good weight displacement of the car over its four corners. So at 70 grand it's reasonably expensive, but I would say definitely worth it. And the final point is that it is of course not a premium model, so you don't unfortunately get an interior, but you can paint the car. So if you haven't tried this car before, I'd strongly recommend that you give it a go because it's a genuinely good machine. And that's it for this episode, so I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.